Let's examine the impact of the African slave trade. Again, this is one of our topics for the European World Unit that we've been doing, and it's actually a continuation of our discussion of capitalism and mercantilism during this time period. So let's get started. First of all, what are the origins of the slave trade? Again, it takes place around the 1500s, and what we know is that Africans were enslaved to fill the need for labor in Spain's American colonies. So after the conquests of the Aztecs and the Incas by Cortez and Pizarro, many Native Americans had died off from disease, and as a result, the Spanish, in their quest for more silver and gold and raw materials, essentially needed more slaves to do most of the work for them so that they could maintain their colonies. If you take a look at this chart on the right, you'll see that the native population of central Mexico suffered serious decline from about 1519, which was at the height of the Spanish arrival, which again 25.3 million Native Americans living in central Mexico. And you can see it declines really quickly. By 1523, there's only 16.8, and by 1548, there's only 6.3 million, and then by 1605, there's only about a million Native Americans left in central Mexico. That's a decline, if you haven't noticed, of over 24 million people. That's a really huge number. And in a very short period of time, really less than a century, a majority of the population passed on. In fact, for all of North and South America, it's estimated that as high as 95% of Native Americans died from disease that they caught from Europeans that were brought over and then spread via trade routes. In fact, in some cases, Native Americans died from diseases long before Europeans even showed up because they spread along the sort of normal trade routes that Native Americans themselves used. But again, had this not occurred, this is something to think about. Had these diseases not come and wiped out these populations, North and South America might not have been colonized by the Portuguese, the Spanish, and even the English. Because if those Native American populations had not declined, they just would have outnumbered the Europeans by millions, and it just wouldn't have occurred. So disease in this case contributed to the ability of Europeans to colonize both North and South America. And again, in Mexico alone, it's a decline of 24 million people. That's a lot of people. Okay, so here are some of the causes then. We know that one cause of the slave trade is the discovery of the New World and the development of plantation economies in the Americas, particularly in the Spanish colonies where they create what we're called encomiendas, or basically these encomienda systems are haciendas or plantations that were used to exploit slave labor to harvest raw materials that would then be sent via triangular trade back to Europe. We also know that tribal conflict in Africa played a role prior to 1500. Africa wasn't a peace-loving, happy place, that different tribes in Africa were fighting with each other as well. And oftentimes the captured Africans from tribal conflict would then be sold to Europeans. So you have a cause that's a result of the New World and Europeans, but you also have an internal cause as well, tribal conflict. In addition, we also know that Arab traders had been taking slaves to North Africa and the Middle East prior to the 1500s. So at least in East Africa, there had already been a long-term existing slave trade that had predated the arrival of Europeans. Keep in mind, though, Europeans do change the nature of the slave trade because in most cases it's about conquest and tribal conflict. But when Europeans begin to engage in this process through triangular trade, it begins to make slavery part of a capitalist system based on money, and people become a commodity as opposed to slaves. Okay, let's take a look at the effects. Obviously, racism is one of the effects of the slave trade. Slave traders would justify the slave trade by using racist views to support their actions. They essentially would portray Africans as being uncivilized. The argument was that by enslaving them, you were giving them work to do and bringing them religion and putting clothes on them as if somehow that was civilizing them. It was a failure on Europeans' part to recognize that Africans had their own culture and had their own civilization. It was just different than European. So they oftentimes used this racist view to sort of justify what they were doing. They also undermined traditional African society. So you can understand where, when you're taking people as hostage and selling them to other people in other places, this could obviously lead to warfare, but also social decline. If you were to take selected people out of your community, they could be valuable members of that community, and if they're being sold off as slaves, they're no longer there, and that undermines society as a whole. Okay, you also have cultural diffusion, which you could argue is a sort of positive thing. That as Africans were moved from West Africa and parts of East Africa to Europe, North America, and South America, they brought with them their cultural baggage. They brought their language, their cultures, their traditions, their religious beliefs. And of course, when they met other people from Africa and forced to live together on plantations, they often shared those beliefs and sort of mixed them together and created, in some cases, new cultures. So culture was diffused as a result of that. And in fact, you think about the long-term impacts of that, African American culture in America led to the emergence of things like the jazz. The tradition of jazz music really has its roots in Africa. And even modern day sort of hip hop music and rap music has its origins in African traditions. And so again, it's had a sort of positive impact long term in terms of cultural diffusion. But keep in mind, overall, the slave trade was a pretty negative event. If you take a look at the slave trade map, you can see the regions where the African slave trade had its most impact. In the eastern part of Africa over here, you can see a large segment of the population was shifted from this area, and then you can see that West Africa also had a fairly significant population movement. You also had, in this case, many of them moving to parts of South America, but mostly to the Caribbean. And in fact, very few people are actually going to be making their way to North America. Most of them are going to be going to the Caribbean and, of course, South America as well. All right, let's take a look then at what the horrors of the Middle Passage might have been like. This refers to the journey that they had to take across the Atlantic Ocean via boat. Now, whippings and beatings were often common on these ships. In addition, disease swept through the vessel, infecting most of the people on board. So the smell of blood, sweat, and excrement would fill the hold in which these people were tightly crammed into. And you can see that captives often lived in their own vomit and waste because they were sitting right on top of each other, many of them not used to the horrors of this sort of traveling. All right, so take a look at this chart. You can see up close lots of people crammed into every possible space imaginable because they're not being treated like human beings. They're being treated as if they're a commodity, like a product or a good, a sack of grain, or maybe an animal to be sold at market. And the idea is to make profit in a capitalist system, you have to bring over as many as you possibly can. And you can imagine how horrible that must have been like to have to sit through that and spend weeks on a ship crammed in with other people like this. It's just unimaginable. Okay, so as a result of this tight cramming, what we also know is about 20% of the people in these ships died of disease or brutal mistreatment. So only about 80%, if you were lucky, actually made it all the way across the Atlantic. The reason you cram so many people in is that if you're going to lose 20% of them, you could potentially lose some of your profit. So the more you can cram in, the more money you can make. And you can see where this is sort of an ethical dilemma and something that good Christian Europeans really shouldn't have been engaged in. Now, one incident that you might want to look at historically is what's known as the Amistad incident. This took place in August of 1839. There's actually a movie that you can see about it, and there's a really good scene in which it talks about the horrors of what it was like to have to go across the sea in one of these very small ships. All right, so what's the total impact then of the African slave trade? We know that about 9.5 million people were actually moved from Africa. And if you look at this chart, you can see that about 40% went to other Caribbean islands like the Dutch, the French, and the British Caribbean islands. 38% went to Portuguese Brazil, so a fairly large number went to Brazil. 16% went to Spanish America and the Spanish Caribbean. Okay, so we're talking about Mexico and some of the other Spanish countries in South America. About 2% went to Europe, Africa, and Asia, and about 4% to British North America. So again, a very small percentage of the population makes its way to what today became the United States of America. So that's not a very large number. And yet, think about all the racial issues that we have today really stem from a very small percentage of the population. And again, South America, Mexico, the Caribbean has a much larger population of people of African American descent and have had a somewhat different course in how slavery ended and the treatment of African Americans in those regions. Now, what does this mean then? At least 2 million people died as a result of this trade. So 9.5 million people were moved, 2 million of them did not make it. So again, you can see on this map, the percentages are pretty similar. 2% to Central America, 4% to North America. Again, most of the people making their way to either the Caribbean or South America. But 2 million people died. This is why some people consider the African slave trade to be a Holocaust, because millions of Africans died against their will by being enslaved and shipped over in this trade. So it's one of these horrible sort of historical events. That's something that we should really know more about because of its impact, not only on the past, but also the impact it's had on present day, because we live amongst people who are of African American descent, many who are only several generations removed from ancestors who were slaves not that long ago in terms of overall history. Something to think about.